Hey guys, Nathan here, Absurd Being. Phenomenology of Perception, number 4, Introduction, part 3 of 4. Attention and judgment is the focus for today. Okay, so the last video we looked at, basically we looked at empiricism, which started from the outside, working its way back to attention. And the way we got there was through this constancy hypothesis. But all that gave us in terms of attention and awareness, perception, was a mechanical, causally kind of effective model, which left us with we got attention, but it's an indifferent attention. It just doesn't. It's not what human experience really appears to be. It's not how we experience the world. Intellectualism or idealism, on the other hand, starts from the inside and begins with attention itself, because that's what intellectualism is all about. And those terms, by the way, intellectualism, idealism, Merleau-Ponty uses them interchangeably, so I will as well. And it's also worth noting, Roy G. Biv noted this in the first video, the idealism that Merleau-Ponty is talking about is that of the individual as the constituting consciousness, the individual as a transcendent mind, creating in some sense, or even literally creating its reality, creating its world. So that's the form of idealism that Merleau-Ponty is criticizing here, and Roy G. Biv mentioned that there are other types of idealism where you don't have that kind of problem of a transcendent mind, but that's something different from what we're dealing with in this, what we will be dealing with in this video series. So intellectualism starts from the inside. We're looking at attention. What is attention? We'll come to that in a minute, actually. But first of all, the problem for the constituting consciousness, from the idealist perspective, is that it sees everything. All objects are equally available to it. Nothing stands out in any particular fashion, because for something to stand out, for something to appear out of the background, something to what am I trying to say? Something to stand out from the rest of the objects around it. If we're talking about idealism and a constituting consciousness, a transcendent subject, then the only way that could happen is through that constituting consciousness willing it to be so. In which case, nothing's really happened, because if the subject makes it happen, then the thing doesn't really stand out. It's another object could just as equally have been made to stand out for it, and so things lose their meaning. A figure on a background loses its meaning if it's all at the whim, if you like, of a constituting consciousness. So that's a problem with this idea of attention, because what we want to know is, how can this particular object arouse my attention? Why does this particular object come to the fore for me? And empiricism, we saw, failed because that's just a stimulus and response type model, and you can't get to there is no meaningful attention in such a model. We saw it's just all mechanical. It's just cause and effect. So you lose this idea of attention. And intellectualism fails because, as I was saying, consciousness is just too powerful. Everything is equally spread out before it, and for anything to stand out, it's just the whim of the consciousness of the subject, him or herself. So let's step back from this a little bit and look at what attention does. What does attention do? So Merleau-Ponty says that it creates a perceptual or mental field and then makes the object appear as a figure. And that's the role of attention. And prior to this happening, all of the objects were merely horizons. So they were this indifferent, indeterminate grouping of things. And then it's attention that causes that one figure to stand out from the background. And I've got a quote which I'll read for you. Attention is neither an association of ideas, that's empiricism, nor the return to itself of a thought that is already the master of its objects, and that's intellectualism. Rather, attention is the active constitution of a new object that develops and thematizes what was until then only offered as an indeterminate horizon. Okay, so I think that's pretty straightforward, and the important thing to think about there is that word, is that phrase, active constitution. It's the active constitution of a new object. And so this says attention is creation. So there is a creative act going on, and Merleau-Ponty says that explicitly. So it's creation. It's not just clarifying a pre-existing figure. Prior to that attention, there was no figure standing out from the background. Attention draws that figure out, but it's not if I can use the expression, a pure constitution, which is what we would have under idealism. It's kind of not just, it's not completely within the control of the subject what figure comes out. There's something more to it than it just being at the whim of this constituting, at the whim of the individual subject. And he gives an example of this, the way that attention works, kind of thematizing a figure against the background with the moon, and the way that if you see it on the horizon and at the zenith, it appears different. If you see it near the horizon, it appears much bigger, and if you see it at the zenith, it appears to be smaller. Obviously, the moon doesn't. The actual size doesn't change, and if you look at it through a telescope, it doesn't matter where you look at it; it will appear the same size. It's actual size, if you like. It's objective size. And so, empiricism would say the way it appears is not correct. It's the same size, and so it would look to say that the retinal image to see, to compare, the moon at the zenith, and at its zenith, at my zenith, at the zenith and at the horizon, and the retinal image would be the same size. So we could say, yes, it's identical, both the same. And intellectualism would come to the same conclusion, but through a kind of an analytic process, reflecting on the image and breaking it down that way. Yet this doesn't deal with the fact that when we see it at the horizon, it appears bigger than when we see it at the zenith, and that's because there are other objects around it. It appears in a field, in a contextual field. Whereas if we see it at the zenith, there's nothing else. There are no other objects. There are no trees or landmarks or anything, no buildings in the way. So appearing on its own, it appears smaller. And that's an example of how empiricism and intellectualism come to the wrong understanding, or they miss the phenomenon. They don't grasp what we actually perceive. Rather, they take what is scientifically true, objectively true, and then kind of foist that on us and say that's our perception, when it isn't. It's not what we actually perceive. So we need to keep that in mind, and that's what attention is. It's the active constitution of an object, developing and thematizing what until then is just an indeterminate horizon. All right, let's move on to judgment. So, what is the deal with judgment? Judgment, the way that the Merleau-Ponty explains this, judgment treats perception as an interpretation of signs that sensation provides. Or it's a hypothesis by the mind to explain the impressions, the sensory givens. And he gives an example of people walking beneath him, say looking out from a second-story window or something, people walking around with hats on. So you can see the hats moving, but you can't see the people underneath. You infer that they're there, that the hats aren't moving on their own. And it's that's the perception. That's what perception is there. It's filling in what's absent from the sensation, from the sensory givens. And it's the claim then that perception always involves this kind of analytic process of judgment. So you have the sensation, the sensory givens, and then they're interpreted. And it's which is what perception is. The problem with that for Merleau-Ponty is it kind of blurs the line between judgment and sensation. And then and for Merleau-Ponty, those two things are different, and we want to keep them different. So he says, judgment is a position taking. Judgment aims at knowing something valid for me across all the moments of my life and valid for other existing or possible minds. Sensing, on the other hand, is the giving of oneself over to the appearance without seeking to possess it or to know its truth. So there's a distinction there between sensing and judgment, which Merleau-Ponty wants to keep. And that's why he says we can't allow interpretation to be a part of genuine perception. And another way to see this is what's called Zollner's illusion. And you can see here that there are two parallel lines, and those vertical lines are parallel, but they seem to converge. They seem to be converging. And for intellectualism and empiricism, this is an error. This is a mistake caused by those additional lines. Similar to what we saw before with the Muller-Lyer illusion. And what Merleau-Ponty wants to say in contrast to intellectualism and empiricism is that those extra lines have caused the main lines to cease to be parallel. They're not parallel anymore. And that's because it's because those parallel lines are appearing in a context. So we're separating out this, or we're not analyzing, we're not bringing a judgment to bear. The perception itself, the way that we originally perceive those lines is as converging. And it's that kind of original perception that Merleau-Ponty wants to preserve here. And he says that the auxiliary lines import into the figure a new signification that henceforth clings to it and that can no longer be detached from it. Again, it's just the same idea. We don't want to analyze. We're trying to get to perception itself, what the actual the nature of our genuine perception is. So taking perception to be interpretation has a couple of consequences. First, it separates the sensible sign, the colour or the odour or whatever it might be, from its signification, from the thing itself. And for Merleau-Ponty, these things are inseparable. They come together. They can't be broken apart. And it means also passing over sensation, which then concerns the constituted, not the constituting mind. And so we're kind of diminishing the role of sensation. Yes, we receive these sensory givens, but then we interpret them. We have to analyze them and rework them so that we get a genuine, correct perception. But that's not doing justice to our actual perception. And that's what we really want to know, right? We want to understand human experience, human perception. We don't want to understand the way that a video camera perceives, or the way that a video camera sees the world around it. So we need that. And in that case, if you're passing over sensation, you're relying on this judgment, this analytical faculty, in order to get your perception. In that case, the mind then precedes the sensations, which means it then confers meaning on them. Because how is interpretation taking place if all there are sensory givens? Interpretation must be, you're interpreting the sensory givens based on something. And if all we have is a constituting consciousness, which is the idealist claim, then that's where the buck stops. It's with that constituting consciousness, not the sensations. And that means that all we're left with then is a transcendent I, a mind separate from the rest of the world. And that's definitely not going to work. In that case, perception is then reduced to the thought that one is perceiving. We miss the genuine phenomenon of perception. And there's a big problem with this, which is that subject is always grounded in perception. So there is, you can't get away from it. It's like idealism is trying to escape the human mode of experiencing, the human mode of perception, the human mode of perceiving, and getting to kind of the truth, if you like, the objective truth. But that subject that is reflecting and analyzing and judging and trying to get to the objective truth is always grounded in perception. And that's, it's built on it. And that's why this whole idea of phenomenology preceding the objective world of science is so important here, because the subject, the analyzing, the analytical subject, the reflective subject is it's always too late. It's already built on this more original foundation of perception. So those are a couple of problems with that. And he talks about, I talk about, based on what he talks about, reflection. I've got a little bit to say about this. He says that intellectualism is right. It's correct that perception is grounded in a human act. So it's not just this mechanical process, the empirical model, if you like. It's correct in saying that there is a human subjective element to it. But the problem, as I said before, that reflection itself is grounded in perception. It uses, and he says, it's kind of nice, he says it uses perception tacitly. And that's his criticism with it. It's not that it's reflective itself. It's that it's in its reflection, it's taking advantage of this perception that it's grounded in, but it's doing it without acknowledging it. It's doing it tacitly. So it's missing it. It's missing this idea. It's always given to itself in an experience, and therefore is not absolutely transparent to itself. Its reflection. It's never. Yeah, it's like trying to look at the world through a pair of glasses, and trying to understand the world and describing the world and cataloging the world, without acknowledging that the glasses that you wear are affecting how you are perceiving the world. So you can catalog everything fine, but you've missed something prior to your experience of the world. I'm not sure if that is a good example, but I think it sounded better in my head anyway. And finally, he says, perception can only be known through perception. We have to look at perception itself. We can't bring in these other reflective, analytical, judgment type ideas. But this is not a complete criticism of reflection, because he says yet, although the perceiving self is different from the self-analyzing perception, and that's the reflective divide. I mean, we can't get around that. This distance can be crossed, he says, but it can only be crossed through a proper account, a proper understanding of perception, which is why we need the phenomenological reduction that gets us to this genuine understanding of what perception is. Despite the fact that we have to reflect. You know, that's just part of what it means to understand something. But we can reflect in two ways. We can reflect forgetting or ignoring that underlying perception, or we can reflect kind of including, bringing that the nature of that perception to light. And so, yeah, it's just kind of easy to be misled by the reflective process. But we can cross that divide between the perceiving self and the self-analyzing perception if we're careful. And that's the idea. That's the whole idea of phenomenology. Okay, so we can get some kind of conclusions here, a bit of a summary about perception. And this is kind of what perception is. So I've got a list of things. First, perception is originary knowledge, which causes figures to appear. So it gets right to the core. It's before we receive these sensations. It's before we analyze these sensations. It's something foundational which causes figures to appear on a background in the first place. And this, if you have read any of Heidegger, sounds very, very close to what Heidegger was talking about with being. And later we'll talk about this as the phenomenal field, but I don't want to get too far ahead of myself yet. He also talks about a second order perception, which fills the space around us with meaning or significations. And this second order perception hides the fundamental phenomenon that we're talking about, this fundamental active perception, which causes figures to appear as figures in the first place. And this, it kind of conceals that a little bit. And at the risk of pushing the analogy too far, this seems to be a little bit close, a little bit similar to Heidegger's idea of the referential totality, and the way things are, they always appear in a context and with a practical signification attached to them. So like you see a hammer, what Merleau-Ponty's driving at, and Heidegger's idea of being, is how this hammer appears as a hammer in the first place. And that's this originary act of perception. But there's a second order act of perception whereby the hammer appears immediately imbued with significance and meaning. And it appears as a tool for hammering. And it appears in context in a broader carpentry context with things like nails and wood and that type of thing. And so all of these meanings are not superimposed, because that's not quite I think that's not the right way to say this. It's not that there is the world is a fundamental is a type of way, and then we overlay these meanings on top of it. That's not the case. The world is nothing prior to these meanings. So this second order perception is still just as fundamental as the originary knowledge we're talking about, but it has the effect of covering over, concealing the way that the hammer appears as a hammer in the first place, because it's just as it appears, it's just full of all these meanings. It's situated in this contextual field, which carries us beyond this deeper layer that Merleau-Ponty is driving at, which is what perception is, this originary knowledge. Okay, so the second order perception is good. I've got an example here. That's Merleau-Ponty's example. He says, when I look around me, I don't see the things themselves. I don't see everything around me. They appear as significations for my intention. Everything appears as kind of a familiar place in which I can focus my attention, in which I can intend different things, and figures leap out at me. But I don't see individual things. Perhaps a good way to describe this is if you've almost certainly had this experience of looking for something, say looking for your keys, and you go through all the places where you think they might be, and finally you find them. And then someone says, what about your wallet? And you think back to all the places you've looked at, you didn't see it. You can't remember it being there. So you go back and check all those same places. Sure enough, it's in one of those spots, but you have no recollection of seeing it. You didn't catch it. You didn't perceive it, because you were so focused on looking for the keys. Everything had that signification for you, key or not key. So when you saw the wallet, you didn't see the wallet. You just saw not keys and moved on. And so that's the idea here, that we don't see things themselves. We see this broader kind of field of that's full of signification, meaning, and intentionality. Okay, and also, and this is important, perception is a non-thetic consciousness. So it's not what's the best way to describe this? It's not explicit. We're not explicitly aware of what we're doing in perceiving, and it's not an explicit act. It happens, in a way, it happens automatically. It's our natural way of engaging with the world. So, in that sense, perception doesn't fully possess itself. We're not like a constituting consciousness, deliberately invoking things. This is all happening at a more foundational level of our being. And Merleau-Ponty describes it nicely as a lived logic, or an immanent signification that's clear for itself, but only knows itself through experience. So again, back to this idea, phenomenology, getting at the experience through a proper understanding of the phenomenon of perception. And there's one other thing I wanted to say here too. Perception doesn't merely discover the sense that givens have. And I think I've mentioned this, but I'll say it again. It doesn't merely discover the sense that givens have. So when we receive these sensory data, perception isn't just finding something in the sensory data. It's not. There's something more going on here. And what the more that's going on is that it sees to it that they have a sense in the first place. That's what perception does. It sees to it that these sensory givens have a sense in the first place. So it's that originary knowledge. It causes figures to appear on a background. Okay, and I just put this idea just in case you're thinking this. Didn't I say a couple of videos ago, or last video, that objects always appear with a sense? Didn't I? And I did say that somewhere. And now it seems I'm saying perception doesn't discover the sense given or in the first place. It sees to it. It creates the sense. Doesn't that contradict what I said earlier about objects always appearing with a sense? It doesn't contradict that, because what I said earlier about objects always appearing with a sense, by the time they appear for us, they are imbued with a sense. And that's by the time they appear for us thetically, by the time we're aware of them, they're already full of this of a sense. They already carry more than just the sensory givens themselves. And that's what this field is. That's what perception does. Perception sets up this contextual field which bestows, if you like, sense on the sensory givens. And so that's what perception is. The last thing which I think we should look at also is motive. And Merleau-Ponty talks about this, and this is actually, it is important as well. So to understand perception, we need this phenomenological reduction. I've talked about that already. We're investigating phenomena, how things appear. And Gestalt theory is useful in this respect. And Merleau-Ponty talks about it with distance in particular, and he says that there are things that are typically, traditionally considered to be signs of distance. And he's talking about the apparent size of the object. So the smaller it appears, the further away it is. Or interspersed objects between the viewing subject and the object. And they add to the sense of distance. And there are other things as well, but those are the types of things that are considered to be signs of distance, significations of distance. But Gestalt theory says that these only appear through an analytical move, so that they only register for us after the perception has already taken place, after the object already appears in the distance. Then we can reflect on why. Yes, there are all these objects in between me and it. Yes, its apparent size is very small. If it comes closer, it gets bigger. And then we can get this feel of distance. But that's an intellectual understanding. There's a prior sense that the object has, and it's that which is given by perception. And so the conclusion then is that we don't pass through these signs or reasons to know distance. And they aren't reasons, is the idea that Merleau-Ponty is driving at. And so Gestalt theory sees that, but the problem with that is, that it treats them as causes. So it identifies that they are they're an analytical addition, and we can appreciate their role in perception and in perceiving distance after an analysis of it, but nevertheless, Gestalt theory sees these as kind of causal feature of our perception of distance. And Merleau-Ponty wants to say that they're not causes, they're motives. And so, before I explain that in a bit more detail, he gives an example of a screen used to block extra objects, similar to the way the telescope blocked other objects around the moon. So we can set up this experiment such that there's an object in the distance and there are objects interspersed between me and the object, and we can use a screen to block those extra objects. And when the screen is moved aside, we see the distance being borne from the interposed objects. The interposed objects in this natural text mean a larger distance. So what we have then is, it's true, these interspersed objects do create the perception of distance. So that's true. Apparent size is because of these interspersed objects. Fine. But the point that Merleau-Ponty wants to make is this is not causality. It's not the same as a cause in the scientific sense of the word, and that, like a billiard ball hitting another billiard ball and then there's an equal and opposite reaction. It's not that type of cause. He gives another example which I think is quite useful in understanding this. He talks about a subject whose oculomotor muscles are paralyzed, so eye muscles paralyzed, and when the subject looks to the left or intends to look to the left, nothing changes because his eyes don't move, or her eyes don't move. So the intention's there to turn to the left. The subject thinks that their eyes have moved to the left. Nothing changes. So the conclusion, which is actually an illusion, the conclusion is that the whole world, the whole visual field has moved to the left, precisely to the degree that the subject intended their eyes to move to the left, such that nothing changes. But the point with this is that is what happens. That is the illusion. That's the experience of the subject, but it's not an analytic deduction. It's not, there's no kind of reasoning behind the illusion. The illusion happens, he isn't, the subject isn't thetically aware that the retinal images have remained the same. They're not aware of what's happening in their retina. All that they see, the only thing that they experience is the moving landscape. The landscape moves. As they move their eyes, the landscape moves. And that perception is immediate and direct. It's not an inference. It's not a deduction. It's not the conclusion of a reasoning process. And it's that deeper perception that we're after. That we're describing, because that is what characterizes human perception. And so what's important here is the intention of the subject to look to the left. That intention creates the illusion. Right? If the subject didn't intend to look to the left, the illusion would break down. It wouldn't exist. And so this means that the movements of one's own body are naturally invested with a certain perceptual signification. They form a system with external phenomena so tightly woven that external perception takes account of the movements of the perceptual organs. And I would just draw your attention there to two phrases: one's own body and perceptual signification. And that's kind of highlighting a connection that's going to be important for Merleau-Ponty, this idea of the way that he interweaves the body with human experience, and the way that he places that at the center, at the core of what it means to be human, in a way that other philosophers haven't done. I mean, Heidegger says nothing about the body, right? There's really no discussion of the body. Sartre does talk about the body in the same way. He's clear that there are two aspects to the body. There's the body as for itself and the body as facticity. And they're very different. But he just doesn't follow that path as far as Merleau-Ponty does, I think. Okay, so there's that. Just getting back to the example and the connection with motive, the images, the retinal images, and the paralysis of the subject's eye muscles, they don't cause the illusion. There's no cause-effect connection here. The intention to move to the left, and the landscape not changing, they're reasons for the illusion. They are motives for the illusion, motives for the experience. So they're reasons, but they're not causes. They're motives. I hope that's clear. And we're calling it a motive doesn't mean that we can then choose whether to experience the illusion or not. That's not the idea behind this. Zollner's illusion, the parallel lines appearing to converge. We can't just will that experience away. It's just a part of how we experience those lines. But in calling it a motive, Merleau-Ponty is drawing our attention to the fact that we're dealing with something different from physical causation, from physical cause and effect. And it's that which is obviously at the heart of phenomenology. All right, we better get to a summary. So we looked first at attention and the way that we saw this was an active constitution of an object out of a horizon, an indeterminate horizon. And that was what attention was. Then the other thing to really take away from this video, I think, is perception. And I'm just going to outline those points that I gave you earlier on. So perception was not a judgment. That is to say, it's not an interpretation of signs. What perception does is see to it that the sensory givens have a sense in the first place, i.e. that they appear in a field. And that's what perception gives us. Perception is ultimately, it's this originary knowledge which causes figures to appear. And it does that through attention. We also talked about a second order perception which filled space with meaning and signification. And it's not like there's something profoundly different here about that originary perception and second order perception, but it's just that second order perception, again, just think of it like the referential context, the referential totality of Heidegger, and the originary knowledge is something like Heidegger's being. Perception takes place through motive, not causes, so that was important. It gets rid of this kind of mechanistic understanding of perception. And perception is a non-thetic consciousness. Those nice expressions to describe it, a lived logic or an immanent signification. Okay, let me stop there. So that's part 3. Next video we'll finish up the introduction, part 4, and then it's gonna start getting serious in part 1 of in part 1 is the next big section we look at. Okay, anyway, thanks for listening. Really interested to see the comments. It seems like this is quite Merleau-Ponty is quite an interesting, or he's a popular figure actually, which is surprising because he isn't popular in wider philosophical circles, but I think maybe he is becoming more popular as time goes on. Anyway, thanks for listening again, and I'll catch you in the next video. See ya.